from the Synoptic Gospels, we pick it up in Sunday school, we absorb it through the teaching and preaching cycle of the church's year. And we just assume that's how Jesus' life actually went, at least the public portion of his life, whether it extended over 18 months or 3 years. Okay. But of course, Jesus' actual life may have been quite different. The only thing we can be sure about is that the birth came at the beginning and the death came at the end. Okay? But the storyline that we just tend to take for granted, and then sometimes are surprised to see John slightly differs about, is actually derived from the Synoptic Gospel agreement. It's not independently verifiable information. Okay. Now it has some surprising and probably historically correct details in there, like the idea of Jesus being a Galilean. That's not what you would expect. Okay. That's not where the social religious leadership of the Jewish community in the Herodian period tended to be located. So you're getting into criterion of dissimilarity and so on here. You're looking for nuggets, not nuggets of the historical Jesus so much, but what are elements of the synoptic story that are probably memories of, sort of valid memories, accurate memories, if you like, reliable memories. So Jesus coming from Nazareth, Jesus being from, as far as we can see, a family without any great social status, Jesus being a Galilean, Jesus operating around the Sea of Galilee in the context of Antipas and Philip, all of those things mesh historically with what we can reconstruct from the period. And at least one trip to Jerusalem, which ended in his arrest and crucifixion. Again, these are not elements which are likely to be created out of thin air, in that sense. Crucifixion was never a good thing to have on your CV. It was not a good way to, was not an attractive hallmark for a founder of a new religious movement to have been crucified by the Roman authorities. Unless you're particularly wanting to appeal to the most rejectionist, right-wing or resistance movement within your culture. And that's one of the debates. Where is Jesus on the scale of resistance to empire? Was he a rebel? Was he a religious leader? Where do those two things blend? He had a rebel's death, so, and the church has a big investment in depoliticizing Jesus.
Well, you've read the Reza Aslan book?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm guessing he fits. I've heard him speak. I haven't read the book. I was quite fascinated by what he had to say. But is he fitting in that particular argument at all?
Yeah, he's written a really good book. I hate him. No, he's written a really good book. I read it when mine was finished, and we're writing the same book in many ways. There's a lot of overlap in content, and he's working out of the same basic context of biblical scholarship, but he's doing it as a professor of English literature rather than as a biblical scholar. And to our absolute horror and disgust, he's made a fortune out of it. He's not even a biblical scholar. I mean, that's not fair. Okay? One really good interview on TV and you make a fortune. And what he's doing is he's picking up and popularising one of the major theological historical debates from the last 50 years, which is to what extent was Jesus a political rebel. Okay? And it's not a new idea at all, but it's an idea which he has not only communicated very well, but he's a professor of literature. I mean, he writes beautifully. And his style is to, not so much to say this is what we think happened, but at various points the book drops into novel, into sort of story mode. So the characters from the past are speaking in the first person, and you feel like you've just seamlessly dropped into the first century and you know what's going on. Because you haven't, but it's a really good book. So we've got these patterns now. As we've seen, one of the issues is that there's a lot more agreement going on between Matthew and Mark, and between Mark and Luke, than there is across the Gospels as a whole. So there's a Yeah. One point that seems to be coming through very clearly is the priority of Mark. Okay, that Mark is a really important document for which both Matthew and Luke have derived much of their content. Where, generally speaking, Matthew and Mark only agree with each other when they're also copying Mark. And if they start to move away from Mark, their agreement with each other diminishes rapidly. And now there are the so-called minor agreements, which mean in brackets of Matthew and Luke against Mark. But the evidence of the minor agreements is problematic. It's based on, obviously, textual readings, manuscript readings. But over time, the Gospels that are being read most often, namely Matthew and Luke and John, tend to get synchronized by the scribes. And so they begin to sound more like each other because they're the books we're reading in church, and over time it's not a conscious decision, but there's an established scribal process of accommodating the text to each other.
So you're dropping Pharisees after the scribes?
Yeah, if it says only said to the scribes and the Pharisees or whatever, and various other things like this. So so we have a number, and so for instance, one particular issue which I want to touch on shortly is that if in fact it's the case that we can reconstruct Marcion's edition of the Gospel, okay, then that copy of the Gospel has far fewer minor agreements than Luke has. All right? Now what does that mean? Well, that means that if instead of comparing Matthew and Luke in order to work out the content of Q, if we compare Matthew and the Evangelion, Marcion's Gospel, okay, then we might get a cleaner comparison than comparing a mid-2nd century, only attested in the 3rd and 4th century version of Luke, okay, which had already the existing manuscripts of Luke already include within them so many accommodations back to the common tradition that the data's been fouled, basically. The data's been distorted. So there is the issue of the minor agreements, and they do have to be taken into account, but the problem with the minor agreements is that we don't have the original version of any of the documents. We only have them in basically 3rd, 4th and 5th century editions, by which time there's been 200 or 300 years of scribal convergence between the manuscripts. Okay? So there are larger patterns of agreement and disagreement, and then there's this minor theme running through the minor agreements, but that's very much leveraged off what could be counter-argued as the scribal tendency for Matthew and Luke to be accommodated towards each other and away from Mark, given that Mark was such a minor voice within the liturgical life of the church. So Mark's in there is a key element in the mix, and almost certainly the first. This is really just verbalising some of the data from those tables. When you look at the material that Matthew and Luke have, which is in the same order as we find it in Mark, then again there's a disproportionate deference to Mark. But that's also because the basic storyline comes from Mark. Basic narrative comes from Mark. What Q has contributed is the content, the teaching material. Okay? But even within the teaching material, Matthew and Luke are more likely to follow a Markan order than they are to reflect each other's order. And that's seen in things like the Sermon on the Mount versus the Sermon on the Plain, where are the Beatitudes placed in Matthew and Luke, and so on.
So you're saying we've got these sayings, and they're just sticking in here and there,
Yeah, and what's being suggested there is that it appears that it's not the case that Matthew has had a copy of Luke, and because then he would have perhaps been more inclined to follow Luke's order. Conversely, it appears that Luke has not had a copy of Matthew, otherwise he would have been more inclined to copy or to reflect more of Matthew's sequencing than in fact we find. Okay. Now, yeah, and again, these are tricky arguments because we actually don't know what Matthew and Luke had available to them and how the process would have worked of using it. Like, it's not like they would have had an open book like that and another book here and would have been working through. They're working with scrolls, probably parchments. So even how the physical process of copying another document becomes much trickier. All right. So what all of this data is pointing to the suggestion that given the strong patterns of agreement when Mark's material is present, given the remarkable diversity of choice and of sequence and so on, and of exact wording when Mark and material is not present, it's all suggesting that Mark is the key player, the key document in this overall. This tends to be reinforced by the suggestion that Mark's literary work is not of a very high standard. His New Testament Greek was not his strongest subject when he was at the evangelist training school, apparently, and his material is most closely aligned with oral content. Now this would be consistent. Well, it's things like the sort of paraphrastic, and then Kai and euthus being used over and over again. So Mark's style tends to be a lot of not tightly integrated elements just joined with either and or immediately or both. So it's stringing things together. And then this happened and then that happened. And it's like when a little kid's telling you about their day and there's no kind of synthesis of it into a bigger structure. Now, all that plays into Joanna Dewey's argument that Mark is really a writing down of what was originally a sort of oral performance. And it's been remembered and at some point committed to writing, but it's not that this was a written text. Matthew, tends to have a better quality of grammar and syntax and to have smoother literary transitions so where Mark will just have and or then or immediately, Matthew will nuance the transitions and give you more of a sense of flow and development. Luke, on the other hand, while not an A-class Greek scholar, certainly writes the most literate Greek in the New Testament. Okay. Now, once upon a time, this was taken as part of the evidence for Luke being a medical doctor. For those of us that have read medical prescriptions know. It's actually unrelated. There's no evidence to suggest that any of the vocabulary is particularly medical or that Luke was a medical doctor or anything else. It's simply that while not as good as classical Greek and some of the other really top-grade Greek that was being written at the time, Luke is the best Greek amongst the early Christian writers within the New Testament. So he's better, he's more at home and he's more accomplished he has better written communication skills in Koine Greek than Paul had and way better skills than Matthew and Mark had. Okay. Again, this is consistent with, doesn't require, but it's consistent with Luke coming from a later stage when people with a stronger Greek cultural background are becoming part of Christianity. And it's less reflective of a Galilean context. So it's not surprising that Luke's not interested in Galilee, and even Easter is not allowed to happen in the Galilee. Because Galilee is Hicksville, as far as Luke is concerned. Insignificant. Okay? And yet, despite those differences, when they're reporting the same passage, Luke tends to be closer to Mark's words than Matthew is. So there's still a dependence on Mark, and although Luke will clean things up, he's not going to be as much of a rewriter as Matthew has been. Okay, so Matthew is more of a copy editor, changes things than Luke has been. And Matthew tends to make the stories longer as he edits them, whereas Luke will tend to abbreviate them a little bit. So Luke will provide his own transitions between scenes and sayings, and they'll be a little bit more sophisticated in their use of rhetorical functions and some of the Greek syntax, but they're never the same as the transitions we find in Matthew at the same point. So again, that suggests independence between Luke and Matthew, at least in terms of not copying, not sourcing the information. Okay, so now, in big picture, there's the dilemma. We have three Gospels that are remarkably close. There are patterns of agreement and disagreement. There are variations in content. There are stylistic considerations, and there are considerations to do with the manuscript evidence and whether or not we can actually compare existing manuscripts of Luke and Matthew in order to determine their so-called minor agreements against Mark, given that we don't have the original copy of Mark and we don't have the original copy of Matthew and Luke. So, and these are not some mechanically reproduced copies. They are handwritten copies from a scribal process within a context where assimilation of the tradition is a virtue rather than a disappointment.
Isn't it the case that a lot of the early New Testament manuscripts weren't done in this Victorian sort of backyard jobs, which accounts for some of the divergence in the manuscripts?
The manuscripts we have, the earliest manuscripts we have, particularly the ones from the 2nd century, 40 to 50% of them seem to be done by very well-trained scribes. However, there's still a gap. We're talking about documents from the 160s, 170s. Paul's letters are from 50 and 60. So there's 100 years. Now, what's happening in that 100 years? Well, whatever happened, we don't have copies of the manuscripts from those 100 years. And one of the debates, which this guy, Jason Badoon, has got into, the First New Testament, Marcion scriptural canon, he's arguing that in fact in whatever else we might think of Marcion, he's actually the guy who gave us the New Testament. Not because he provoked the others to put it out, but because he actually put it out. That he defined the New Testament, and that everybody else has done a catch-up job and said, well, good job, but we're going to claim it, kind of thing. So, and one of the points he made, up until Marcion's edition of the letters of Paul, which we can probably date to around 130 or so, was there a single edition, collection of Paul's letters? What scribal processes, what document management processes do we imagine going on through the 50 or 60 years between the death of Paul and the time of Marcion? Who's looking after these documents? What social institutions would there be there to manage the document process? And the answer is none. It's local communities who happen to have copies of Paul's letters, making copies for each other to send to friends from other places, and gradually people acquiring a set. But the first set, which is attested, is actually Marcion's edition of the letters of Paul. Now everybody says, because of Tertullian and others, that he expurgated Paul. Maybe he didn't expurgate Paul. Maybe he simply collected the Paul that was available, and subsequent to Marcion it got elaborated by the other side. Okay? Just the other side was the side that won, and the other side is the side which ordains us. Okay? So, as historians, we can't assume that the winning side in history is the side that actually kicked the home goal, or the winning goal. Okay? So it's a bit more complex than just taking at face value the critique of Marcion, which could well have been valid, a very appropriate criticism of his nasty anti-Semitism and so on. But in dishing him on those issues, have they also fudged the fact that actually Marcion was the one who pulled together the letters of Paul for the first time. So what's going on here? So that's not to say that he was right about Paul or right about the Old Testament, but that he actually might have had a very significant historical function in generating the Pauline corpus. At a time when Paul was on the nose, generally in early Christianity, and Marcion and the Book of Acts, in very different ways, are part of a rehabilitation project to reimagine Paul and set up Christianity in the form that we now know it, where Paul is up there with Jesus in terms of theological significance. But maybe it didn't look like that in 125. But how would we know? What would count as evidence? Yeah? And if we thought we knew, what would we do with that information? Okay? Probably wouldn't make a video and put it on the online. Anyway, okay. So there are a couple of possibilities. The dominant, popular explanations are basically explanations that involve Mark and Q. And the so-called four-source hypothesis has been the one that really dominated in the middle of the 20th century and is perhaps not as popular now. It's probably going back more towards the two-source hypothesis. In other words, people are less inclined now to imagine that these traditions must have existed as documents. Okay, not just oral sources, but documents. There was an M document, there was an L document, and so on. Not called M and L, but So, in other words, like when I look at that kind of theory today, and I might say if I buy into the Mark Q hypothesis, then I say, well, where does Matthew get his other stuff from? It's not found anywhere else. I'm quite happy to say he made it up. He used his imagination. Now, if he were an artist painting it, we'd have no problem with that explanation. But because we're so fixated on the words in the book representing things that actually happened, we run a mile at the suggestion that one of the evangelists just made it up. But we'd expect him to make it up if he was a musician or a graphic artist, a painter or a sculptor. Okay? But not if he's writing a book, because books are about facts.
Just to clarify, where Q is the hypothetical that contains a much of oral tradition?
Q is the, it comes from the German word Quelle, meaning source. It's just a symbol used in the middle of the 19th century for this other material, which was not the P source, as in Peter, but another source must be Q. Okay. Now it's come to be identified as the saying source, indeed as the Q Gospel, and up until the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas, everybody said, look, there's no evidence that there was ever such a thing as a gospel entirely made up of sayings. Dong. 1948, we found the Gospel of Thomas and realised we'd actually had fragments of it for another 50 years, hadn't realised what it was. So these are people talking in the mid-air and totally wrong. Okay. So Q in this kind of diagram is the sayings gospel Q. And it's imagined as a text, exists in written form, and it's in Greek. Okay. Now the Hermeneia commentary on Q is about this thick. Okay. It has the critical edition of Q in Greek, and it has translations in English, French and German with extensive commentary. Not bad for a non-existent document. I mean, it's a wonderful exercise in scholarly imagination. Disciplined scholarly imagination. Okay? Source critical work.
Greg, is there much crossover between Q and Thomas?
There is, and that then raises the question. So then you get issues like, what is the relationship then between Q and Thomas? Some sayings are in common. One explanation is that the Gospel of Thomas represents what came of the Q tradition in the East, in the Syrian context, and also in the sort of Islamic Jesus tradition. Okay, and I've written a book chapter on that a few years ago, because the material that's in the Islamic traditions about Jesus appears more typical of Q. Okay, and not surprisingly, the Islamic tradition will be interested in Jesus as a prophetic teacher. What is Jesus in Q? He's a prophet who goes around teaching the da-da-da-da-da. So, and he's not a miracle worker in Q. It's a saying source. I mean, some of these go with the turf. If it's a sayings gospel, he's not a miracle worker. So, so we don't get too excited about the genre aspects of it. So part of the theory is that Matthew and Luke, particularly Luke, represent what came of that Q tradition in the West, and the Gospel of Thomas is how that sayings tradition continues to develop in a more esoteric direction in the eastern parts of the Roman Empire, as in Syria and Mesopotamia and so on. And there's a small group of about 37, I think it is, in the mid-30s, 35, 37 or so sayings which are common to Q and Thomas. Dom Crossan calls them the common sayings tradition and suggests that they're the absolute essence of what we know about the teaching of Jesus. Okay, now again, I'm not so sure about that, but once if your methodology, as Dom's has been, is to identify discrete sources and then you find overlaps, then methodologically you're going to focus on those overlaps. Hence your question about the relationship of Thomas and Q. Yeah. So it's all there. I mean, all that sort of stuff is there. So, but certainly the if you like, the best, most technical, most sophisticated scholarship on Q is work done by John Kloppenborg. And in John's view, he's got a book called Excavating Q. In his view, the Q material is not only surviving in Greek, it was written and composed in Greek. And the parables and the sayings in Q are constructed by a Greek-thinking, Greek-speaking person. Okay? So that has certain implications for whether or not Jesus said the parables. Shall leave now? Okay, then there are explanations, and sorry, to go back to John Kloppenborg, who's a friend of mine and a colleague from Bethsaida. He, to give him his credit, and he's been a long time, member of the Jesus Seminar, but not really involved in the historical Jesus stuff. He's actually not interested in the historical Jesus stuff. Of no interest to John at all. He's only interested in the history of the Synoptic gospel tradition. So he's quite happy with an answer that says the parables were composed in Greek by a Greek-thinking writer. Because he's not looking for Jesus. He's only wanting to explain the origins of the gospel tradition. Okay, and he's absolutely quite clear. Do not mistake me for a Christian. I'm not interested in Jesus. Okay? I am interested as a scholar in the Synoptic gospel tradition. I'm not interested in Jesus. Now that's a different agenda. Okay? Then there are explanations which manage to deal with Matthew, Mark and Luke without engaging with the Q hypothesis at all. One of them is the so-called Farah hypothesis, and this is basically where Mark Goodacre and before him Michael Goulder came in. And for those that are interested, this is where Jack Spong comes in. He really adopted Michael Goulder's approach to the Gospels, and Michael Goulder, who was an Church of England priest who lost his faith and resigned his priesthood, is a real hero to Jack Spong. So a lot of Jack's work around the Gospels reflects the Goulder, the Farah, Goulder, Goodacre hypothesis. Okay, that's where Jack's coming from. And the basic answer there, of course, is that Luke had access to both Mark and Matthew, and that explains everything. Okay. Now, it has the advantage of Occam's razor. Let's not multiply extra explanatory steps. We have a copy of Mark, we have a copy of Matthew, we have a copy of Luke, and we can explain everything in Luke by his editorial decisions relative to Matthew and Mark. Okay? Now clearly not everybody is persuaded by that. In fact, most gospel scholars are not persuaded by that argument. But it's a growing, it's a powerful, it's a cogent alternative to a model which is perhaps overly invested and mortgaged in the idea of ancient documents being combined in a process of literary editorial action. Okay, and there's another version of it, more the sort of Griesbach hypothesis, which has the prior. So the difference here is basically whether Matthew or Mark is the creative original document. So for the Farrer hypothesis, Mark is still the first document, but there's no need for Q, and that's the Mark Goodacre stuff. But there's also an alternative which actually says, no, actually Matthew was the original, and then Luke is derived from that, and Mark has tried to do a condensed version of both Matthew and Luke. So it just reverses the literary relationships. Now logically any of them are possible. All of them require dealing with evidence, and not all of the evidence neatly fits in with any one explanation. That's partly because we do not have the original text. We're dealing with manuscripts, multiple manuscripts, all of which are a couple of hundred years after the final, well, depending when you date Luke, will be at least 50 to 100 years after the final production of the book. Then there are versions that have Luke first, and one of those is, of course, the Jerusalem school hypothesis, which has an Aramaic tradition which goes through a recension. Luke picks this up. This is what he's talking about in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Luke is then used by Mark, and then Matthew draws on the whole lot. So Matthew becomes the final word, and Luke is pushed back to a much earlier position in the process. You do not have to know all this stuff. You do not have to remember all this stuff. I'm just looking at some of the eyes that are sort of going around in circles. Okay, this is just getting a sense of the malaise, of the sort of molasses, the literary molasses that Synoptic Gospel Studies is in. Okay, so there are a couple of, so this is the kind of the common dominant position that you'll find out there in the literature and so on at the moment. That back in the 60s, more or less parallel to Paul, as Paul is running around the place building churches or creating churches and writing letters and managing this network, somebody somewhere, perhaps in the Galilee or on the coast of Caesarea or wherever, maybe Bethsaida, not really, is putting together a collection of the sayings of Jesus. Okay? In the aftermath of the Jewish war, sorry, I've got too quickly through that. In the aftermath of the Jewish war, you get the Gospel of Mark, which is aware of some of that stuff, but it's actually drawing on other sources, other material, much of it oral, to talk about Jesus as the prophet, the eschatological prophet, and probably encapsulating the story as a Jerusalem is the city which has killed the prophet sent by God, and now look what God has done to the city who destroyed his prophet. And that's a plausible explanation for Mark's Gospel. Subsequently, Matthew realises, well, the story's gone on. We've got to keep talking with the Jewish community. Many of us are Jewish. We need to deal with this tradition. And so by drawing on Jesus the teacher from the Q material, Matthew does an update of Mark, which is more relevant to the needs of Jewish Christianity in Syria, in southern Turkey. And then Luke, a little bit later than Matthew, as it could be similar to Matthew, it could be 10, 15, 20 years after Matthew, that Luke is putting together a kind of final version of that triangulation. Okay, but that Luke is totally independent of Matthew, and he's unaware of Matthew's update of Mark's Gospel. Now, and it's really important because as soon as you introduce Luke using Matthew, you've undermined the need for Q. Because you can explain the Q material as stuff Luke got out of Matthew. Okay? So it's really important for this model that Luke was unaware of Matthew and did not use Matthew, which makes Luke a not very well-informed reporter from late 1st, early 2nd century. But that's okay. An alternative theory, without Q involved, would look something like this. Mark is composed around about 75, mid-70s. Again, there are all sorts of debates around that. Matthew is composed 10 to 15 years later as an update, improvement on Mark's story. And Luke Acts is written somewhere around the end of the 1st century, 100 AD, plus or minus 15 years. And Luke is directly drawing on Mark, but he's also drawing on Matthew. And that's the sort of classic Farrer, Golder, Goodacre sort of approach.
It seems to have the benefit of being simpler.
It's simpler, but it has. There are, if you've read all those, 3 or 4 chapters we had as background reading this week, it does imply that, for instance, Luke saw the Sermon on the Mount and thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to break that up and distribute it over. It's hard to imagine Luke dismembering the 5 discourses of Matthew's Gospel and scattering it around in different places. The infancy story are entirely different. Okay, the baby's called Jesus and his birth certificate has Bethlehem as the location, okay, and his parents' names are the same, but it's an entirely different story of where Jesus comes from and what it all means and so on. And of course the Easter traditions are just so totally different. So is it really plausible that Luke has basically got all his non-marker material out of Matthew and then scrambled it? Like he had all his index cards worked out, then he tripped over and dropped them and never quite managed to get them back into the right sequence. So it comes back to plausibility. What do we think is going on here?
Notice on this not read that Luke Acts and the other one you only had Luke.
Yeah, that's just a source critical reduction or critical thought. Different slides from different times. Yeah, I mean the earlier version tends only to talk about the creation of Luke. That's true. When I'm looking at this, particularly if I'm seeing Luke as a 2nd century, then I'm more likely to talk about Luke Acts as a conscious literary creation. And then, of course, part of the story is Luke does not stop at the resurrection. Luke goes on to the ascension and to the early church. So you've also got to factor in, where is Luke going? He's not just updating Matthew, he's not just updating Mark, he's writing a different thing, which is Luke Acts. And Luke Acts has become a trendy kind of double act in the last couple of decades. And yet another alternative way of mapping it would be to talk about Proto-Luke back in the 60s, in the space where Q has previously been. In other words, to say, sure, there is evidence that Luke has gone through, especially around about beginning of chapter 3. There's a distinct break in Luke's Gospel. Chapters 1 and 2 look like they've been bolted on later. Okay? So what if what people have tended to call Q was actually what was the earliest draft of material that ended up in Luke, in what we call Luke? Okay? You'd still have Mark over here, which may or may not have some awareness of that Q Proto-Luke material. You'd still have Matthew down the bottom, and Matthew could be accessing that body of material which otherwise would be called Q, or Proto-Luke. Luke Acts is then going to, of course, be the final result of an extensive process of redaction over several decades, just as the Mark tradition ends up with Matthew over several decades. John's Gospel goes through early, oral, later stages, multiple redaction, forms John's Gospel, like a sort of literary tell, and then Luke Acts is like another literary tell with layers of tradition. Okay, so that would be another sort of way of doing that, and that's really just saying, well, let's not call that early thing Q. Let's just say Proto-Luke was Q. In effect, Q becomes Proto-Luke. Now, I found that attractive a couple of years ago. I'm no longer persuaded that's the best explanation. There's another one. So let's look at our new friend Marcion. You've heard about Marcion in early church. He tends to be ignored in New Testament studies. Okay, and that's part of the artificial divide between the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. Marcion has typically been represented as a person who generated the crisis over the canon because he put out an edition of Paul's letters with all the Jewish bits cut out, okay? And he got rid of all the rest of the Gospels but just kept Luke with the Jewish bits cut out. Okay, now that's a misrepresentation, probably, of Marcion by people in the second half of the 2nd century who were on the other side of a theological argument with Marcion. However, in making their criticisms and spending so much time attacking Marcion, who they genuinely disliked and disagreed with, they quoted him so extensively that we can actually reconstruct Marcion's work, okay? Which is kind of nice. It's not dissimilar to a situation that emerged in the mid-80s where the Dead Sea Scrolls had been discovered, and for 40 years only a couple had been published. Very few fragments here and there, the big 7, and then there were thousands of fragments and they were just not coming out because they'd been assigned to various scholars who had a monopoly on their publication, and they were taking forever to get through them. They assigned this one to this PhD student, this fragment to that PhD student, and nothing was coming out. But photocopies had been made, photographs had been made of the scrolls in case they got damaged or destroyed, and there was an archive copy in the US, as well I think another one in Europe. And somebody got access to the archive copy for the purposes of producing a concordance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the way the concordance was done was you got the word in question and you got 3 or 4 words on either side. But then, of course, with computer technology, you could actually put those together and you could reconstruct from the concordance the entire Dead Sea Scroll corpus. And they cried foul. You broke my academic copyright. Yes, and we also let this information loose for the rest of the world to have it. So within 6 months, the rest of the manuscripts were released. Okay. So because of the extensive quotations in a technical concordance and computer technology, we were actually able to reassemble the text, which we had in the archives, and they brought them out, and yes, lo and behold, the scholars were right. Now, a similar kind of process has been going on here. There are so many quotations and descriptions of what Marcion had included or not included, and quotations from Marcion, that in fact you're able to reconstruct with a reasonable degree of certainty, far more certainty than you can with Q, what Marcion's Evangelion and his Apostolicon actually look like. Now, the most recent example of that is this book, Jason Badoon, the First New Testament Marcion Scriptural Canon. What he's been able to do is to go through and to reassess the arguments for Marcion's documents down, in some cases, to a line-by-line, word-by-word level. Okay? And to establish with a reasonable probability, I think, I'm persuaded, that Marcion's Evangelion, his Gospel, was not a version of Luke expurgated by Marcion, but a version of the pre-Lucan material prior to it going into its post-Marcion Lucan form. And the canonical Luke is an anti-Marcionite document. Okay. Rather than Marcion having edited Luke, Luke is in fact an attempt to get back at Marcion, which gets into your question before about who's who in the zoo and who's fighting with who and so on. Okay?
Can I just sum up what you just said? I think was that we've got Marcion has a copy, or has written a copy that is essentially pre-Luke or Q,
Yeah.
something that's similar, a copy of that. And then Luke has, in response to that, revised that material and includes some sort of discounting Marcion's...
more Catholic stuff. Yeah. Now, so the facts of the case, if you like, are that everybody agrees that round about 130, 140, Marcion published a Gospel and what he called the Apostle. Okay, the Evangelion and the Apostolicon. The Apostle was Paul, and the Gospel was this single document, which looks very much like Luke, except it's missing a few bits. Well, so people said, but in fact, part of the counter-argument is that actually Marcion left lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of Jewish bits in both Luke's Gospel and also in his version of Paul. So what's Tertullian going on about? Well, Tertullian doesn't like Marcion, so he's accusing him of this and this, okay? In other words, so the facts are, everybody agrees, including the early 2nd century Catholics, Marcion published an edition of the Gospel, which is very much like Luke, but not quite the same as Luke. And this was the only Gospel that his Marcionite churches used. Okay? They didn't know Matthew, they didn't know Mark, and they didn't have John. They just used the Gospel. Okay? It's not called the Gospel according to Marcion, it's just called the Gospel. Evangelion, the Gospel. And then he had the Apostle. And the Apostle was Paul, and it was Paul without the pastorals and Paul without Hebrews. In other words, exactly what most modern critical scholars would call the authentic Pauline letters. Okay? So everybody agrees that's what Marcion did. Now the question is, was there a pre-existing larger version of the Gospel and the Apostle which Marcion has edited down to put out his sectarian edition? Or is the canonical form of those texts a post-Marcion reaction by the early church? Okay? Now, depending on, and they're historical judgments, and it's who's blaming who, how do you read the evidence, da-da-da-da-da. What this guy is doing is basically rehabilitating Marcion, saying Marcion did not go through and edit Luke's Gospel to create a defective Gospel. He was preserving the form of the Gospel that he inherited from the churches on the Black Sea where he came from. Okay? And it is not a creation by Marcion, it's simply the version of the Gospel which Marcion authorised for use in his church, which was a series of churches spread all through the Eastern Mediterranean that almost ran the Catholics off the map. Okay? Very seriously almost became Christianity. Okay? And it was Christianity that was rather anti-Jewish and rather suspicious of the Old Testament, all of which makes sense in the politics of Turkey in the early 2nd century. So we can understand it sociologically. So leaving all that aside then, say, well, okay, so then he has a 3 or 4 page bit towards the end of his discussion of the Gospel, where he says, what are the implications of this for biblical studies? Pages 91 to 96, thereabouts. And what he's saying is that Marcion's Evangelion is actually a pre-Lucan witness to the form of Q early in the 2nd century, and therefore is a better text to compare with Matthew when we're trying to work out the form of Q. And I actually think he's onto something. It's only last year's book, there's a process of reception and peer review and so on. I think he's onto something really significant.
There could be another one of those little models in years to come.
Don't have to wait. It's right here already. I've already done it. Okay.
He's my great cookies, Daddy.
Okay. So you have in the background, you have what are called the Miracle or Signs collection. Now this guy, Robert Fortner, cut his teeth as a scholar by working on the Signs source, the Book of Signs for the Gospel of John. Okay, and that's an established part of New Testament scholarship. And there seems to be overlap between the Book of Signs in John and the central material in Mark, where you have a series of gospel signs and miracles, 2 sets of 5. There's a similar set of 5 in John's Gospel. So what I'm saying is, top right-hand corner, there's a collection, not necessarily written, which has a standard set of miracles, big things Jesus did, powerful things Jesus did. Then you've got the sayings of Jesus being collected, which we typically call Q. So let's call it Q for the sake of keeping the neighbourhood happy. And then you get finally the creation of Mark's Gospel, which draws particularly on the miracles and signs collection, but makes very little use of the sayings material, which is already there, but Mark just isn't into sayings. He's dealing with the destruction of the temple. He's got a bigger story to focus on. Matthew comes along 10 or 15 years later, and he also has access to this Q material, which lo and behold, we have another instance of independently. It's actually a separate manuscript, and we even possibly have at least one ancient papyrus example of the Evangelion, which previously has been seen as a variant Lucan manuscript. Could actually be a Marcionite manuscript. Okay, but because we thought Marcion was a nasty boy, and this looked like Luke, but it's a bit funny, so it's a Lucan manuscript. Maybe it's actually a manuscript of the Evangelion. Okay. Indeed. So we've got the Q material also now attested independently in Marcion's Evangelion, which we won't meet until the 2nd century, but which is a nearer to Matthew than existing Luke is. So the minor agreements issue, I mean, 2/3 of the minor agreements disappear if you compare Matthew with Marcion, which is interesting given Matthew is very Jewish. Marcion's meant to be anti-Jewish, but his gospel has far fewer discrepancies against Matthew. There are more anti-Jewish elements in Luke than there are in Marcion's Evangelion. So finally we get Luke. So the point of the dotted line there is to say, was Matthew's version of Q the same as the Evangelion or a parallel version? Doesn't matter. John's Gospel coming out around about 100, drawing on the Q material, drawing on the signs material, and even possibly drawing on the Mark's Gospel for, say, the Passion narrative, which is the one point where John and the Synoptics are close together. Finally, we get the emergence of this, what we call Luke and Acts, down the bottom of the page. I'm still dating it, at least Luke, around about 120. I think Acts is probably nearer to 150. Okay, but the point is the material that we get in I can't do it with the pointer, but what we get in the Evangelion is on the trajectory that ends up in Luke, but it is not an expurgated version of Luke. It's an independent witness to the same tradition that goes in, that we find in Luke. Now, if that proposal gains acceptance in the academy, then it will have an impact like this on the reshaping of synoptic relationships, because then the significance of Q will be enhanced, because we not only have a genre example in Thomas, but we have a content example extant in Marcion's Evangelion. Okay, and Marcion's Evangelion has far fewer of the minor agreements, textual accommodations, which we find in canonical Luke. Because Marcion's text was not being copied by the Catholic scribes. Therefore, it was not being accommodated to the Matthean and the Johannine vocabulary. All right, so on that cheery note, while we haven't finished, I think we'll call it quits for this session. Go and have a cup of coffee. Okay?